Hi, my name is Kristin Sandvik, and I'm going to chair today. Welcome to all of you. We're very excited about seeing so many of you here for breakfast seminar. This is almost a record turnout. The topic of today is Return to Somalia, a New Era. This event is co-hosted by the migration group at PRIO and the newly established... Whoops. It's not
you have
coming.
to point it that way.
Is it? Sorry?
Put it on. Yeah.
Newly established Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies, which is a collaboration between Christian Michelsen's Institute in Bergen, NUPI, and PRIO. And we are proud to have the Heritage Institute as a collaborating partner in our project on the protection of civilians. The Heritage Institute is the first Somali think tank, and it's based in Mogadishu. And it has a very ambitious plan of becoming the premier Somali research institution and a premier institution in the Horn of Africa, which I'm sure you will succeed with, given what I've seen so far. Somalia is currently on a fragile path to recovery, or at least to something else, after 2 decades of armed conflict and continuous humanitarian crisis. It has a newly elected government, which has been recognized, for example, by the US. But it's also facing enormous challenges in putting together basic national policies, in containing disputes, dealing with land struggles and continuous fighting, as well as harsh immigration and refugee return policies from Kenya. With us today, we will talk a bit about what kind of challenges are facing this newly established government. And we have an extremely competent panel with us. We have Mr. Abdi Ainte, who's the founder and executive director of the Heritage Institute. He's an award-winning journalist with 10 years of experience and has written for, I was going to say, almost all major newspapers and has been consulted and published worldwide. We also have Anab Ibrahim Noor, could you please get up, who will join us for the Q&A section. She's a researcher at the Heritage Institute and a lawyer and has years of experience in human rights and litigating in the British justice system. We also have Cindy Horst, who is an anthropologist and a senior researcher at PRIO, who has published widely on refugee issues, return, diaspora, and remittances, and is an expert on the Horn of Africa. So I think I'll just give the word to you, and then you'll have 15 minutes. Yes, please.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in Oslo, a fairly cold place compared to where we came from, Mogadishu. But kind of a reminder of where I spent formative years of my life, which is in the middle part of the US, which is as cold as it is in here. What I will do is I will give you a brief overview of what I think are the recovery signs that we see in Somalia today. And then I will talk about the return of diaspora and refugees, Somali refugees and Somali diaspora to Somalia. And then I will talk about the issues that the diaspora and the refugees are facing once they return to Somalia. But let me tell you a bit about the Heritage Institute, just a little bit really. We're a brand new organization just established in Mogadishu, and are trying to figure out a lot of things ourselves, to be frank with you. But I think our mission is twofold. What we're trying to do is to inform and influence public policy through research and analysis, and that's something, it's a bit of a challenge in an environment like Somalia where policies are not always formulated through research or through analysis. Our second mission is to promote a culture of learning and research and inquiry. And what we're trying to do with this is a number of things. I think the most ambitious one under the promotion of research and learning is that we're trying to rehabilitate and reopen the Somali National Public Library in Mogadishu, which is this 4-story building that has been in ruins for 20 years, and now we're in the process of reclaiming it and repairing it and hopefully making it a library. It's a massive project that we're working on with a number of other actors, both inside and outside Somalia. Now, let me just give you an overview of the situation in Somalia today. After more than 20 years of civil war, Somalia appears to be on a path to recovery. A new parliament has chosen a new president last September. the President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud has selected a new Prime Minister, Abdi Farah Shirdon, widely known as Sa'id. The Prime Minister appointed a lean cabinet of 10 ministers. The new political leadership in Somalia is generally seen as a more credible, capable, and less corrupt. The renowned Somalia scholar, Professor Ken Menkhaus, describes the new Somali leadership as constructive elite. I think he's trying to say that the former elite were quite destructive elite. There is a modicum of stability that's now returning to Somalia in general, but particularly the epicenter of the violence over the past 20 years, which is Mogadishu. The militant group Al-Shabaab is down, but not done. They were on the back foot since August of 2011, when they lost the most vital real estate they controlled for 3 years, which is the Bakara market in Mogadishu, the largest market in Somalia, which, according to studies that I have been involved, was generating about 40% of their overall operating revenue. That was a turning point in the conflict in Somalia. The defeat of Al-Shabaab is largely led by a 17,000-strong African Union peacekeeping mission comprised of troops from Burundi, Uganda, Kenya, Djibouti. Another contingent is expected from Sierra Leone over the next few weeks. Ethiopian troops have also been operating in different parts of Somalia, though not always under the remit of the African Union. The regions that are recovered from Al-Shabaab are now significantly safer than they were just a year ago. For example, in Mogadishu, you see a lot of reconstruction. Business vibrancy is slowly but steadily returning. Traffic jams are very common, especially in the neighborhood we live. And quite stunningly, I think nightlife of some sort is actually returning to Mogadishu now. All of this, I think, is led by and driven by the diaspora Somalis who are flocking back to their country in search of opportunities and in an attempt to contribute to the peace-building and state-building phases of Somalia. Somali refugees are also returning from neighboring countries in large numbers, though much of that influx is due to an involuntary repatriation from neighboring countries, namely Kenya. And much of this repatriation has taken place in the weeks and months ahead of the presidential election in Kenya, which took place on March 4th. We did a study actually on this particular subject. Anab was the author of that study, and you may have seen a copy of it. We've had some copies around here today. A full-fledged report looking at the implications, political security, as well as the economic implications of repatriating some 600,000 Somali refugees in Kenya. Somalis returning from the diaspora and from refugee camps in neighboring countries face new and old challenges. First, the old challenges. Despite the recent gains and lots of optimism, security remains extremely fragile. As we've seen in Monday's suicide attack in Mogadishu, which killed 10 people, unfortunately 10 civilians, civilians in Somalia still face enormous risks. Prior to Monday's attack, Al-Shabaab has carried out at least 5 other suicide missions since the new government came to power in September. 4 of those attacks targeted restaurants and public places populated by diaspora. You may remember that, in fact, one of the people who were injured in one of these attacks just a few weeks ago at a beachside restaurant was a Somali woman from Canada. Her husband, Abdurrahman Badio, was a presidential candidate. The new Somali government does not have the institutional capacity to provide security to the population. In fact, the Somali government has only 6,000 police officers in Mogadishu, a city that has about 2 million people. The other security services, primarily the military and NISA, the National Intelligence and Security Agency, have been accused of all sorts of human rights violations. The latest one took place just in this week, when about 8 bodies have been found on the streets of Mogadishu, allegedly killed by the National Security and Intelligence Agency. These prisoners were allegedly taken away from prisons in Mogadishu by the National Security Agency. And the military, of course, as you may have been following the case of the rape story that has taken international attention, has been also accused of committing similar violations, including murder and rape. And then there are new challenges that are facing Somali refugees as well as people returning from the diaspora. The most, I think, poignant one is the land issue. there is a widespread land disputes across Mogadishu and also Lower Shabelle, and probably in other parts of Somalia as well. I mean, this is a common challenge in post-conflict environments. People are reclaiming their properties, but they're often finding that there are new people occupying their homes once they return from the diaspora. The land issue is worsened by three main factors: the absence of credible documentation, as much of the country's files are either stolen or destroyed during the civil war. Secondly, the lack of a governmental institution that can properly investigate and adjudicate the rightful ownership of land. And thirdly, the competing narratives of land ownership in Somalia. There are those who view that the land dispute, or they view it through the lenses of the last 20 years of war. And then there are those who view the whole land issue that an issue that has been going on since 1969, when a military government came to power and overthrew a dictatorship, a democratic government. The allegation here is that second narrative is that the military government has actually appropriated and taken away a lot of land, and therefore land disputes and resolutions of land disputes should go back to 1969. Now, what's the way forward? I think after 22 years of civil war, famine, terrorism, piracy, there are reasons for optimism in Somalia. For the first time in 2 decades, a permanent government led by politicians with some credibility is taking root in the country. The main rebel group, Al-Shabaab, as I pointed out, is on the back foot, though they continue to pose a serious security challenge to the government as well as to the population. In fact, Al-Shabaab still controls a substantial part of Somalia, particularly in the south as well as in the center of Somalia. And they have the capacity to fill any vacuum that is left by the government or by the African Union peacekeepers or by other troops, as we've seen this week in the town of Hudur in Bakol region, where Ethiopians have left and the vacuum was immediately filled by Al-Shabaab reclaiming that city. I think despite these gains, conditions are not right for an involuntary return of Somali refugees to their country at this point. The gains made are easily reversible, and a reconciliation among warring communities is a work in progress. We see this demonstrated very well in the dispute that is now going on in Kismayo, the third largest city in Somalia, where communities are still trying to figure out what form of a government or shape of government to take, and the federal government in Mogadishu getting heavily involved. Land disputes are common, and land disputes have the potential to lead to the re-eruption of violence. I would conclude by saying that Somalia has a long road to full recovery. It has only now taken the first baby steps in that direction, and I think we should all be mindful of that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Abdi. I will be talking about protection, displacement, and return to Somalia. So I'll talk about the repatriations a bit and also about diaspora return. Before I start, I want to say a little bit what this is based on. So first of all, it's a project that is part of this humanitarian center that Kristin already mentioned on protection of civilians from principle to practice. And this is a project that runs at PRIO CMI NUPI from 2012 to 2016 and funded by the Research Council of Norway under the Humanitarian Policies program. And it's led by Kristin. The main question we are trying to answer is what is the role and impact of contemporary policies and practices of protection of civilians. Then I am actually engaged in the case study on protection of displaced Somalis, humanitarianism and displacement. And what I'm looking at is what is the protection regime for refugees as compared to internally displaced in Somalia. So refugees in Kenya, internally displaced in Mogadishu and Hargeisa. And the work in Mogadishu and Hargeisa has largely been done by Anab, so she'll join us also for the questions. There, it's a collaboration between PRIO and the Heritage Institute. The main question is how do humanitarian actors define and implement protection efforts for Somali refugees and also for the internally displaced, and also how do the displaced themselves define protection and find protection. So comparing the protection understanding of those who are the UN, the government, etc., who are there to protect, and the displaced themselves. So the research is in Nairobi, Mogadishu, and in Hargeisa. Maybe I should also say that what I'm saying now and afterwards is also based on almost 20 years, I'm embarrassed to say, 20 years of field work amongst Somalis in Kenya, as well as in Minneapolis. That's where we met many, many years ago, and in the Netherlands and in Norway. Now, protection and displacement. I think the first statement I want to make, which I think is really, really crucial, is that moving away from an unsafe area remains one of the main ways in which people can protect themselves from the consequences of violent conflict. So movement is crucial for people to protect in cases of war and conflict. I think that's the starting point. At the same time, there is this shrinking protection space, as it has been pointed out in many studies and by many academics, and that is both the case actually during conflict. So it's increasingly difficult for people to find protection and to move to areas because of restrictive migration regimes, because of border controls, but like I will argue later, also because of aid policies actually. Which is something that I'm exploring in Nairobi as well. But it's not just the case that protection space is shrinking during conflict, but actually also in this transitional phase towards stability. And I think there Somalia is a very good example. So the protection that people find who are in exile, who are in places like Kenya, in places like Sweden and elsewhere, it's increasingly difficult for them to maintain that protection in a transitional phase where very easily there's thought of, okay, a return, repatriation. And of course, there's a big distinction, like you also mentioned, there's a very big distinction between voluntary and involuntary there. Just to point out this kind of understanding of a shrinking protection space, it's very important to see that actually there's 15.2 million refugees in the world. 26 million internally displaced, as UNHCR has taught us, but 1.5 billion people still live in countries affected by fragility, violence, or conflict. And this is from a World Bank study that PRIO colleagues actually collaborated on and have very extensive data on. So people must be protected during conflict, but also during flight, in exile, and when they return. A number of very interesting questions then that come up is who has the ultimate responsibility to protect those who are displaced? Since very often they're outside their country of origin, or if they're not, maybe the country that where they're at is not in a position to protect themselves. So who has this responsibility to protect? Is it the UN? Is it international organizations? Is it the government? And of course, the law says a lot of things about that. And I think there ANAP really has to help me out. But in practice, it's so much more complicated. And also, of course, this question of how people protect themselves. And there, I want to use a small quote from someone in IDP camps in Mogadishu, a young woman who was interviewed, who basically explained in the IDP camps, internally displaced camps in Mogadishu, there are real security concerns. There's actually real severe risks. And what this young woman says to ANAP is, okay, I protect myself by staying quiet and by not going out much. I have to watch my mouth as well as my feet. So that's the strategy that people can use in those kind of difficult conditions that internally displaced camps are. Now to say something on regional return and protection. First of all, Dadaab. And I picked this picture also because it's very illustrative of the kind of challenges that are there. These are seen to be, they're building semi-permanent, this is a couple of years ago, they are building semi-permanent housing in Dadaab, and that caused a big discussion because even though people have been in these refugee camps since 1991, it's still seen as a temporary place. So the moment you start building more stable housing, what does that mean? Are people going to be staying? Is that an opportunity or not? So one of the things that Einte also mentioned is that the Kenyan government has been talking a lot about actually relocating the refugees across the border and moving them from being refugees to internally displaced across the border with Somalia. And there I feel the role of humanitarian aid actually comes in quite strongly because very often what happens if a country is seen to be in a transitional phase is that the money of the donors will reduce the funding that is there for refugee camps. So slowly what you see is that people are not forced to return, but the resources that they have to live in a refugee camp will slowly decrease. And with that it becomes more difficult to survive in Dadaab, which is a semi-desert. So it becomes more difficult for people and they have to look at other opportunities. Then Hargeisa, I think, is a very interesting case also to look at return. There's a lot of discussion on relocation, but also on return. And I don't want to get into too much contentious issues here, but I think one of the things that's very interesting is that there's a clear distinction the government makes by distinguishing those who are internally displaced and who are not. And of course there's a dispute on what constitutes Somalia and what constitutes, there's differences of opinion on whether it's a federal state or whether there's independent states. So what you see is that the government actually distinguishes Somalilanders as internally displaced, but Southerners as illegal foreigners. Not as refugees even, but as illegal foreigners in their policy. And then in Mogadishu, there's now also talk about relocation outside the city to improve security inside the city, but then also as a kind of temporary solution towards return eventually. And again, Anop talked to one of the people working in these internally displaced camps who was talking about what relocation would actually mean. And what this person said is, and he's Somali from Mogadishu, saying that these people are left vulnerable because of their situation. They're considered to be refugees in this country. There's no word for IDP in our language, so that's why people call them refugees. But these people are no different from you and I. They are Somalis as well and have every right to work and live in the capital. And I think that's a very interesting question as well. Like, okay, if you live in your own country, but you live somewhere else where you're originally from, when are you displaced? And when are you just moving from the countryside to the city? So when do we call people internally displaced and when not? And we can make these slides available also if you're interested. We can put them up on the website. And then a little bit about return from Europe, North America, the diaspora return. I think there's many different types of returns we're talking about. So on the one hand, the diaspora return, people like Einte, people like Anna, who come and really there's a strong arch and a strong kind of willingness to contribute. There's an opportunity to contribute. There's an eagerness to contribute to Somalia now because of what's happening and because of some of the possibilities that are there. But at the same time, of course, there's other types of returns that are going on. There's returns of rejected asylum seekers, and I think, as I think you mentioned as well, now also return of deported deported criminals then. From the US, which is a main concern in many other countries as well, where people serve their punishment, but then afterwards are returned to their own country. And of course, these are very different types of return with very different protection consequences, both for the people involved, but then also ultimately for Somalia. So what are some of the defining factors on whether people are protected or not when they return? I think, first of all, legal status. Because there's such an uncertainty about the future in Somalia, there's optimism, but there's also great uncertainty. If you have a passport, you're much safer off because then you can always go back. So you can try, see if it doesn't work out, you can come back. So the protection of a passport or a permit allows that. Another question that's very important is where are you returning to? return to Somalia, but what does that mean? If you're from a certain area, from a certain village, is return going to that same place, or is it going back to Somalia? And of course, there's a lot of differences there, depending on what is the general situation, security situation in the area that you're from. Are you able to get protection from the systems in place there? So return, what does that actually mean? And then I think what is also really important is what resources do people return with? Do they have property to go back to? Land, which, as you mentioned, is actually also a great cause for disputes. Are there social networks that you can rely on? And what kind of skills have you gained abroad that you can actually contribute to the country? I think those things are really important. And there it makes a difference whether you've lived in Australia for 25 years, haven't managed to go back, or if you've had regular contact with your relatives and managed to visit. So those are some of the things that I think are really important to say, okay, when we talk about return, we talk about a lot of different things. And that has a lot of different implications for the people involved, but also ultimately for the future of Somalia. Thank you very much.